Good evening and welcome to Writers Unplugged. This is a series that will air throughout the year in support of Cleveland Reads. And Writers Unplugged is a chance to hear your favorite or perhaps new to you writers in conversation, as if you were eavesdropping on them in a coffee shop. Cleveland Reads is an initiative to improve the literacy levels in our Cleveland community, and Mayor Bibb has challenged Clevelanders to collectively read 1 million books and or 10 million minutes. And I have to say, as of this morning, we were at 4.4 million minutes, which is awesome. My name is Jen Jumba. I'm a librarian here at the main branch of the Cleveland Public Library. And one of my favorite things besides reading is talking to writers. It's an opportunity to get to know them. It's an opportunity to understand what inspires their stories, where they like to write, essentially getting to know them better and see them as human beings and not just the name on the spine of a book. And we are so lucky this evening to have Wendy Walker with us. But before I get started, a couple housekeeping notes. To find out who else is visiting Writers Unplugged, both virtually and in person, visit clevelandreads.com/unplugged. Max Back's Books on Coventry is our wonderful independent bookstore, and they have copies of Wendy's books just waiting for you. So a brief introduction to Wendy. Wendy Walker is the author of psychological suspense novels, All Is Not Forgotten, Emma in the Night Before, Don't Look for Me, which I still can't look at apples the same way, and American Girl. Her novels have been translated into 23 foreign languages, top bestseller lists both nationally and abroad, and have been optioned for both television and film. Wendy holds degrees from Brown University and Georgetown Law School and has worked in finance and several areas of the law. As a former family law attorney with training in child advocacy, Wendy draws from her knowledge of trauma and psychology to write compelling and complex characters and stories. Wendy's latest, What Remains, is her best book yet. Yes, I say that with every book Wendy publishes, but this is the truth. She is an incredible storyteller. And for me, this means she is an auto-buy or pre-order, which is really important to writers, every single time. I think you'll all feel the same way after our conversation if you don't already. And here is the contained fangirl moment. Wendy is an even better person. I remember meeting her for the first time in Toronto. And when I mentioned I was a librarian and a huge fan, she immediately said, "Hey, let me give you some books to make sure they're on the shelves in your library." And at that point, I was fortunate enough to work for a large library system who pre-orders her books as well. It is that generosity of spirit to get books into the hands of readers that speaks to her as a person. And then when you get to know her a bit more, she's just as smart and funny and as kind as they come. So join me in a warm welcome to Wendy Walker.
Hi, that was so sweet.
Oh, you're quite welcome. So we'll start by talking about What Remains. So this is not quite a month old. It's like 3 weeks and 2 days, but who's counting, right?
Yep.
And it's done incredibly well, which I'm not surprised. Do you want to tell people who are watching and listening a little bit more about What Remains?
Yeah, I would love to. So What Remains is a story of cold case detective Elise Sutton. And she is placed in a situation where she makes the terrible decision to take one life to save another. And this sets off a terrifying game of cat and mouse with the man whose life she saved.
Yes. Where did the inspiration for this story come from?
So it actually came from a real life shooting that happened in Boulder, Colorado a few years ago. And I was driving in my car and just listening to the news when the story broke. And the first people that I heard interviewed were bystanders who were streaming out of the store and giving their account of what happened. And then they disappeared from the news because there were, victims' families and survivors who had been injured and the first responders. And I remember thinking, what happened to those people? Because their stories and their voices were just so traumatic and poignant. And I knew that they were not going back to normal life, that they would be going through something after that to process that trauma and to sort of put it in a place where they could go on living. And when I did research into trauma, I discovered just so much about what happens when someone experiences something like that. And I decided I wanted to write about it. So of course, because I write thrillers and I need a lot of plot, I
Mhm.
decided to make this person more than just a bystander. So I thought about who would make this character, or what would make this character more invested, more involved, more traumatized, and have more of a connection to the events that would live on after, in the aftermath. So that's when I decided to make it a detective.
Right.
And then I was speaking with my local resource, who is a cold case detective about all things police related. And she was talking about her job. We talked for like 2 hours, and I found her life and her work so interesting and unexpected that I decided to make Elise a cold case detective and to shape the story around that.
Okay. I have to say, one of the things that I love about your books, besides the pacing and the story and the plot, is the characters, that you're able to make them so human, so incredibly complex, that they're not all good, they're not all bad. You start to understand why they do what they do.
Yes. So I think characters are just so important.
Mhm.
And and I try to really do research into this psychology, and I try to have all of them in every book dealing with something that can explain their behavior, because it's a thriller. So this, they're going through something extraordinary. Their actions and the events in their lives in the book are going to be extraordinary. And so I try to, shape the arc of the story and their reactions and all of that to something that's really based on real psychology. So in this case, what I found so fascinating about the research is that when someone goes through a trauma like this, they often are expected to return to life and be grateful that they were not injured or killed, and to see life, through a different lens, a more positive lens, a more grateful lens. But the reality is that what they're going through is processing the emotional reaction to the fear that they felt. And so there's a part of their brain, the emotional part, that is screaming, don't go back to normal. Something really terrible happened and it could happen again. And that trauma response has to be processed. And there are these stages that you need to sort of go through in order to put that experience away, so that you don't live in constant fear and have PTSD triggered constantly. And if people around you don't understand that, there can be this isolation and a feeling that you are not seen, and a fear that you're not going to be loved for who you are now, because you are changed. This is now a part of you going forward. And that can be extremely isolating and create a great deal of loneliness and depression. And so Elise is feeling all of those things, and that informs her choices in the book, which aren't always the ones we might make or think she should make. But she feels alone, she feels isolated, and she feels that she's the only one who can get her through this, terrifying situation with the man who's become obsessed with her.
Right. I think that this goes to what you just said, because one of the things that Elise mentions in the book is, after a traumatic event, that common sense and reason are typically the first things to go.
Yes, that is true, because again, the brain is processing the emotional response to this traumatic event, and it's disconnected from the rational thinking part of the brain. So it doesn't matter how much you talk to yourself or try to talk yourself down from the emotional response, you can't stop it. And it's really fascinating. I could go on for hours about trauma psychology, but I think the takeaway is that our brains are designed to keep us safe. So when we are exposed to something that puts us in danger, the response is to be on high alert and to be in a constant state of fight or flight and fear until that event is processed. and that the emotional part of the brain becomes convinced that the threat has passed, and that we're now safe. So yes, there's a whole process that people go through to get through to the other side of trauma.
Absolutely. Having experienced a little bit myself, not to that magnitude, but one of the things that strikes me is it's not linear, right? It's not like after 2 weeks, this will happen. Then after, week 3, this will happen. It's not predictable. You think you're fine, and then something happens and you feel like, oh my gosh, I'm all the way back at square one. And I was watching Elise, and there were moments where I'm like, okay, she's got it. And then all of a sudden, like, no, she not quite yet, but it speaks to those stages that you have to process.
Yeah. And, that's really the heart and soul of the book is a study in trauma. And I really wanted to explore what a female police officer goes through after an experience like this. And that was really inspired by a real cold case detective that I spoke to, who described the emotional sort of responses that she has to the situations that she finds herself in. So I thought it was really important to the book to
absolutely
let her feel those things and react to them, and sort of behave in a way that is going to be true to those. I mean, she's not going to go and be rational and think straight and make all the right decisions.
I mean, a lot of people don't do without trauma on a daily basis.
Exactly.
Right? So,
yes. Yeah.
But I think you captured that so wonderfully. And I think, hopefully people, or not hopefully, I know people will pick it up, because it's, what remains, it's your book. And I'm hoping that they'll feel, if they've gone through something traumatic, not that this is, a self-help guide, but then they'll begin to understand maybe themselves a little bit, that to know that what they experienced was normal and typical.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, one of the sort of things that happens when, I'm able to do a deep dive into psychology and sort of have these characters that are hopefully founded on the real psychology, is that people will write to me and say, wow, that is actually what it's like to have a narcissistic mother, or wow, it's actually what it's like to have attachment issues, or to have grief. And so hopefully people who have gone through processing a sudden trauma like this, will find it true to form and what that experience is like. So yeah, it's really important to me when I'm writing to weave that in. And I always have to go back and take some of it out, because it slows down the plot. And there's, structurally as an author, there's always this push and pull with giving life to these deeper issues and then moving the plot forward. So hopefully it's a good balance in this book.
Absolutely. I think if I were to talk about one of your hallmarks every book, is that amount of research you do to make sure whatever situation your characters are placed in rings true and authentic. So, and you did it again. Absolutely.
Thank you.
So the other interesting thing about Elise, and this is not a spoiler, is that she was a professor and she taught a class. So do you want to talk a little bit about, I'm going to let you reveal the name of the class that she taught and how this weaves into the story.
So it's How to Commit the Perfect Murder. And it's a class where she is, and actually this again came from the, the research that I did with this real detective. With cold cases, it's not always about following the evidence. Sometimes it's about already having the suspects and trying to use new technology to rule them in or rule them out. So you already have the evidence.
Right.
The evidence is already pointing to certain suspects, but at the time of the case, there was no DNA or no facial recognition or no internet, Google searches, all of these things.
Yeah.
And so now, all these years later, you have this evidence and it can be processed through new technology.
Right.
And so she will sort of try to rule in or out the suspects using that new technology and thinking. And so the idea of thinking like a criminal is to think about if you were going to commit a crime, what technology is out there that could trip you up? So now, I mean, there's DNA, there's, so much, there, everything we
Cameras
do.
everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, think about these cases like this, so much true crime is out there now in podcasts and TV shows. We hear about it all the time about, oh, well, the cell phone was found at this spot. And then, I mean, we have our phones with us all the time, and we have no idea that they're recording how fast we drive and when we were in one location or another location, how long it took us to move around. All this data is being collected. So if I guess the first thing you're going to do if you want to commit a crime is like turn off your cell phone and leave it somewhere that will exonerate you. But so I thought that was so fascinating that to actually be thinking forward about the evidence that could be collected. Like if you're committing the crime, then you can already think about what evidence will allow them to lead back to you. And then you can plant other evidence that will lead away or take steps to remove that evidence. And that's a very different thought process than thinking about how to actually perpetrate a crime and getting it accomplished. But the second step is thinking about how to make the evidence lead away from you or to exonerate you. And so she's teaching this class, and I'm going to call him Wade. It's not too much of a spoiler, but the man whose life she saved, that's the first alias that he uses. And he has been accessing her class online that she used to teach, because she's been updating it over the years with her cases. So now he knows everything that she knows. And in a sense, she's playing this cat and mouse game with herself. And I thought that added a really interesting dynamic and element to it, and fear for her, because she's now having to think, 2 steps ahead, 3 steps ahead.
Exactly.
What do you think I would do? So I have to do something different, and like double reverse psychology.
That's exactly. Yeah, all I can think of is the Friends episode.
Yeah, double reverse psychology. My kids would always say that to me. So she's kind of having to do that, right? Because he's inside her head by being inside the work that she's done as a detective and posted online for her students.
Yeah, to me that was amazing, because she's trying to think like he would think, but then think like she would think, so that all I can think of is that Friends episode where it's like, they know that we know that they don't know. It's hard to explain. You have to read it to experience it, and then it makes perfect sense, and it's done with a stroke of genius, because then like Wade gets in my head, and I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm talking to characters, they're in a book. I'm like, Elise, don't do it. What are you thinking? Right?
Yeah, definitely. And it was fun to write, but it was also challenging, because I was trying to come up with things that were sophisticated enough that readers would find interesting, not just, so there are all these things that I, researched and wove in. And wow, now with AI, not to go off topic, but, it wasn't really around when I was writing the book, but now you could just ask AI, like, give me the top 10 coolest forensic things from cases. And in 5 seconds, you'd have a list. So I had to do a little more research on that, but now, wow, I'm actually very excited to dive into my next book, and it just makes the searching for these things so much more efficient and deeper. You get right to the heart of it.
Yeah. Speaking of research, Angela's asking, what are some of the best resources that helped you learn about the trauma process?
Oh, so, well, now I would ask ChatGPT, right? But what are the stages of trauma recovery, or what do I need to know about trauma to write a book about it? And it would tell me. Because I was a family law attorney years ago, I sort of know how to research psychological issues, and also writing, these books for many years. So I just start poking around on Google. Stages of trauma recovery, what you need to know about trauma, chat rooms about trauma, blog posts about trauma. There's so much out there. And I think it's a good combination to have sort of clinical studies, and then to read blogs and things written by people who have actually gone through it, because you can kind of get the language, the emotion, not just the clinical, term for everything, but what it actually feels like to be in denial, or what it feels like just finally have acceptance of it, and to have forgiveness and all of these things that are just words. But when you read what they mean to people who are going through it in this context, it gives it a lot more depth and guidance for writing the characters.
Yeah, I think you dovetail those so beautifully, right? So that we know it's grounded and real, but yet you have the authentic person's voice, who's experienced it firsthand. And sadly, people do. So I'm joined by nationally and internationally best-selling writer Wendy Walker. One of my favorite questions that comes up in this book is the question of how well do we really know somebody? We think we do, but we don't. And then how that ultimately leads, and we talked a little bit about it before, but it ultimately leads to this form of loneliness.
Yes.
So,
yeah. So, oh my gosh, that was the most poignant thing that I read, and I had to find a way to weave it into the story, was this concept of being changed inside from an event like this, but physically unharmed. And if you have a physical injury of any kind from any source, people automatically, have empathy for you, and they treat you differently, and they ask how you are, and they make that automatic assumption that you have been changed by what's happened. But when it's an emotional injury, and that's really what it is, it's, people don't see that. And if they haven't experienced it, it's not, I think, lack of empathy. It's just not knowing that there should be empathy in this situation, because they haven't gone through it. And we're generally uneducated, I think, about emotional trauma. It's getting better now, but, it's sort of, I think, there's just not a lot of sort of talk about it. It's been something people have kept to themselves because it's somehow shameful, that they can't just get over it. And so when I was reading about this concept of loneliness, from feeling unknown, and not just in this context, but just in general, like people who marry someone and they've really not sort of been expressing themselves fully in the relationship, and then years go by and they start to feel unloved and feel lonely because they haven't shared their full true selves with their partner. Or if someone has a secret that they're ashamed of from childhood or from the past that they haven't shared with loved ones, that relationship, that love can be compromised, and they stop believing it. And that can create even more profound loneliness than not being around a loved one at all. And I thought that was so interesting, because we think of loneliness as being alone.
Yeah, physically.
Physically alone, yeah. But when you feel that someone loves you, loves a version of you that's not complete or not accurate, that can be even more painful. So I had to weave that in. And so that's, how she feels with her husband, less so I think with her partner and her children, because, they're so little, but definitely with her husband.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think a lot about that. And then I think about your work as a family law attorney. Like, how much of this did you know when you were practicing? I mean, I'm sure you knew some, but is there more depth now because of what you're writing?
Yeah, what's been so interesting is writing these books and doing this research.
Right.
And I think at the time I was practicing, I was learning about some of, narcissism and things like that. We had training courses to advocate for children. And also, actually, we had some classes to try to identify these clients before we took them on. So, we'd have these like seminars on how to identify a potential client who has a personality disorder, because you don't want to make that person a client. So it always ends badly. But then after, when I was writing and I was thinking, I would think back about some of the people I encountered and some of the cases and the dynamics, and think, wow, that's what that was. So it was sort of a combination of having experienced it, not necessarily having labels for everything.
Yeah, words for it, right.
Yeah, but now, when I was researching narcissism for Emma in the Night, I mean, really doing a deep dive into narcissism and then thinking, oh my gosh, that's what that was going on in that family. Or that's maybe why those kids were the way they were. And, you know, things that didn't come up in the litigation, but things that you just noticed, you didn't know, you kind of knew that something was not right. And then, so yeah, so doing the research now and being able to connect the dots back to people that I actually experienced has been, I think, you know, again, I like to add it to my, my ability to sort of, you know, craft these characters accurately.
Yeah, well done. So I'm joined by Wendy Walker. Latest book that just came out, not quite a month old, What Remains. The cover itself is stunning.
Thank you. Yeah, I love the cover.
Yeah, it makes me want to put like a border, you know, and through my, no, I'm just kidding.
I have this giant sign that that my publisher gave me to for this one event, and then so I've taken it to a couple of events, and it's just this enormous book cover with Elise, you know, on it, and it's great.
The other interesting thing that comes up in this book, and I think in a lot of your books, is that we might experience the same thing, but we see it differently. And
Yes.
you mentioned, or I say you, Elise, mentioned something that just struck me, especially considering you had a career in law, is we forget 50% of what we see.
Yes.
So plays well into your hands as a thriller writer, right?
Yeah. So Matt, I mean, this is, you know, when I'm explaining the setup for this story, Elise is, you know, she's in the towel aisle. She's just in the store to buy these towels for her daughters, and she's coming back from an interview. So she has her gun. She, you know, she's whatever. She's still sort of, she's off duty, but she's not, you know, she has her gun, and she hears the pops that she recognizes as gunfire. And, you know, she goes through all the emotions of fear and doubt. She's never fired her weapon before, and she relies on her training, and she pulls her weapon, and she turns this corner, and she sees the scene, you know, the scene of the shooter pointing a rifle at this man, this tall man with his hands in the air. And then she ducks back behind the aisle to process what she's seen, make a decision about what to do. Then she turns the corner again. And when she turns, the tall man sees her, his eyes go to her. The shooter sees that, so he whips around to see what this man's looking at.
Right.
Sees Elise with her gun drawn. Then he starts to turn back around with his rifle. And just then this tall man starts to run for cover in the dressing room. And Elise takes the shot because, you know, in that moment she thinks, okay, he's turning back around. He knows I'm here. He wants to take this man out, and he's going to fire. And she kills him instead of letting him kill the tall man. But when in the hours and days and weeks that follow, she can't remember that split second if he has cleared the doorway to the dressing room, if he was safe. And everyone around her is telling her what, you know, what we are thinking as we're reading it, that it doesn't matter. He had a gun. He was firing it in the department store.
Exactly.
It doesn't matter if this man, he could have gone in after him. You could have lost your chance, all of these things. But for her sense of peace and to move on, she needs to know, and she can't remember. And the reason she can't remember is because that memory is not there. When we are in, and we know this from witnesses to crime, that when we are in that fearful fight or flight state, the brain chemicals are too busy trying to tell us what to do, and they sort of block our thinking brain, and definitely block the capacity, the chemicals that are required to store memory. And there's a survival reason for that, which is if we stop and think when we are in acute danger, we could die. So we need to rely on our emotional responses. The emotional brain has to take over. Yeah, it has to take over and override all thinking, all everything, and just take over and keep us safe. Instinct, pure instinct, emotional reaction, and instinct. And so she has no memory, and she needs to find the tall man to find out what happened. And that's what makes her vulnerable, because he is obsessed with her and wants to connect with her. And so he takes advantage of her need to connect with him and find out the truth to infiltrate her life. So that was a key part of the story, and it dovetailed so well with the actual memory science, which is, you know, what I wrote about in my first thriller, All Is Not Forgotten.
Yes.
And it's that science has stayed with me. I'm like, that's with me all the time. Every book I write, I'm like, memory science, memory, you know, all of that
Absolutely.
stuff is so interesting. Yeah.
Fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about the structure of this book? Because you're talking and telling it from, you know, Elise's standpoint, and then there's the alternating chapters from a different perspective.
Yes. So they're called the Kill Room chapters. And they're not every other chapter. Sometimes in my books, I have like a, you know, every other chapter is a different point of view. This is, these are sort of sprinkled in. And, you know, I was very aware that they were pulling readers out of the main story, which is really meant to be page turning and suspenseful and just tell me what happens to her kind of thing. But I really wanted to take those beats and add this other intellectual layer to the story, which is in this sort of these backwoods where there's hunting, and there are these hunting shelters, and one of them has a cremation oven in the basement for an animal cremation oven, but it's kind of a large one, and so some hunters find human remains in the cremation oven. And talk about research. That was, I mean, doing research on cremation. I won't go into it because it's kind of, but, and I tried to, you know, be very sparse in the book about describing it. But yeah, that was eye-opening. But anyway, there are human remains are found there. And in this shelter, there was a murder 3 years ago that was drug related, and sort of an execution style killing in this room that what is now called the Kill Room. And it's the room where the hunters take the deer that they've shot and they dress them, which is, you know, a very kind word for, you know, what they do.
I was going to say it's the opposite of dressing, but yes.
Yeah, exactly. And then they cremate the remains of the animals. And so the Kill Room it plays in it. The whole story leads back to the Kill Room. Yes. So anyone who reads the book is getting impatient with those chapters. Just know that you will find out who's narrating them. You will find out the time frame at the end, and you will, and everything's going to lead back to that room.
Yes.
And so weaving those in, and knowing I was going to be getting to that ending was really, it was just fun as a writer to do that, but then really challenging because I knew it was a big ask for readers to slow down and read those chapters because they're told in a very sort of matter-of-fact, forensic way, and you don't know who's narrating. So I added a little bit of personality to them, but not a lot, because I didn't want anyone to really know who's narrating those chapters. And they're really very matter-of-fact, but they're short. They're very short. So hopefully, you know, readers will take a beat and read them. And
you'll be so glad you did, because at the end,
good.
I won't say, but no, stick with it. It's so well worth it.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit, because I think as readers, and if there are writers here too, we're always curious about your process. Like, do you know what you want to do from the beginning, or does it kind of change along the way? How does that work?
Yeah. Wow. So by the time I start writing, I pretty much know, because I'm a plotter. So I have to plot it all out. That doesn't mean it won't change, but, and sometimes it changes because I'll come up with a new twist or something sort of fun that I want to weave in. And so then I go back and thread it through, but I always stop. I thread it through the chapters I've written, and then I thread it through the plot outline that I've drafted. And, but yeah, I pretty much know where I'm headed, because I feel that when you have, especially 2 points of view, they need to feed off one another. And so it's really important where you're disclosing the facts. So what I do is I think about the plot, and I actually draw it on a piece of paper, and I like make little arrows and lines, like, okay, this character is connected this way. And then I type up a list of disclosures that have to be given to the reader along the way to make the plot hold together. And also, when those disclosures need to be known by certain characters. So, for example, you know, if a character is going to find out a suspect was at a crime scene, There's a point where the reader knows that that suspect was there, and there's a point where maybe the detective knows that a suspect was there. Those could be two different points in the story if there were different points of view, or a third person narration, you know, where you're not always with the main character. And so I just plot it out. I do my disclosure sheet, and then I have a chapter outline, and really the chapter outline just has sort of the scene, but most importantly, what disclosures need to come in that chapter.
Okay.
So that's the scaffolding, or really these, what I call disclosures. Yeah. And from there, I will, sometimes I know the scene that they'll come in. And sometimes I build the scene, like what would be the most natural way for my characters to discover this, or to be able to describe it to the reader. And then so then I'll sketch that out, and then I'll write the chapters. And that's where all the character development comes in, as I'm writing around the scaffolding, like sort of building this building around the bones, will come all of the descriptive things and the character development. And so like in this book, I was not planning on having Elise and Mitch, that's her husband, have a problematic marriage. But then I was just writing a scene, and they were having a conversation, and all of a sudden, you know, he made some comment, and you know, about it not being like what happened 4 years ago. And then I thought, oh, what happened 4 years ago? I just wrote that. So okay, obviously I'm feeling the need for them to have some problems. And then so I made him have an affair, and then I was like, wow, that could be a cool plot twist. So then I had to come up with a plot twist around that affair and weave it into the rest of the story. Absolutely. So that happens too, where, you know, I'll have a moment where I'm filling in, you know, the building around these disclosures, and something will sort of come about.
Wow. I think it's fascinating that you know essentially what you want to happen. And yet when you're writing it, it still has the pacing where that I'm like, I have to read the next chapter, right? And at the same time, you're not tipping your hand too much to what the reader knows, because you're doing a kill room perspective.
Yeah.
And you're doing Elise's perspective. And I think that's the thing that amazes me, is that it's as if you don't know. It's as if you're writing as a pantser, because the pacing is there to make you want to turn the page, right?
Yeah. And so the funny thing is, I have so many friends who are pantsers, and they're always, you know, we always joke with each other, like, come to the dark side, you know. And I'm like, well, who's the dark side? The plotters or the pantsers? But so with this book, I knew where I wanted to go with it, the very first draft, but I was sort of frustrated because I couldn't really decide. So I thought, I'm going to try to pants it, because I know it starts in the department store. And 50 pages in, we were still in the department store, because I was finding all these interesting things to write about, all the emotions that she's going through. And then she turns this corner and sees these people, and everyone's going through something. And, you know, it's very traumatic. And so I was just experiencing all of these people, and what, you know, what it might be like, and then doing more research and reading stories of people who have been in that situation. And I was still writing about it 50 pages in. And I always stop at a certain point, and then I try to read what I've written to see if it's working. And it was not working. It was I'm like, okay, this is interesting to me, but the plot, there's no plot. The plot's not moving. We are still in this department store. So I had to scrap that of all the 50 pages, and I put them in I put them in a separate document, and I drew from them into the first chapter, and then I tried to weave them in, because I really was attached to those moments in the store. Some of them I ended up not using, but it was much harder to go and like have to do that than if I had plotted and done it the way I always do it. So I will never pants again.
Yes, it's exactly right. I guess it was like an experiment. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, so the other thing, I'm talking with Wendy Walker of What Remains, national and international best-selling writer. The other interesting thing that comes up in this book is trying to reconcile the intellectual part of our brains with the emotional part of our brains. You know, intellectually we know something, but yet somehow emotionally. So there's that tension that exists in this book as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, wow, there's so much out there now about this. I feel like every podcast and book is about trying to understand our emotional responses to things, and then to process them. And one of the most interesting books that I read had this sort of an analogy to a radio, like an old-fashioned radio with a, where you turn the station with a dial, or you push buttons to change the station.
Right.
But what she was saying is that our emotional responses to things are developed over time with our experiences with people, with so for example, a hot stove, right? We intellectually, we are taught that a hot stove can burn us and we should not touch a hot stove. And if you've never touched a hot stove, that thought will remain as a sort of an intellectual thinking thought. It will not be there'll be no emotional response when you see a red hot burner or a flame burner. You'll just know, oh, the burner's on, don't touch it. That's a piece of knowledge that I have. But if you learned about a hot stove by touching a hot stove and hurting yourself, that is going to create an emotional response. That is a memory. It's an emotional memory. And so every time you see a hot stove, you're going to have the intellectual knowledge and the emotional memory. And they are going to be separate things that you're going to experience every time you see that hot stove. And so what she was saying is that sometimes in life, a hot stove isn't a hot stove. Sometimes, if for example, if you first smelled flowers at the funeral of a loved one, you may always associate grief and pain with the smell of flowers, and it may trigger you, even though flowers are sort of benign. Your association, your emotional association, is with pain. And what she was saying is that we can tell ourselves that and say, stop feeling that way. They're just flowers. There's nothing wrong with flowers. You're just, and then we can take another step and, go to therapy and learn that, that's
where that comes from.
Yeah, that's a good step, but it's not going to change the emotional trigger. And she said, it's like trying to change the station on a radio without touching the dial or touching the buttons. You're just screaming at it like, stop playing this song. But the radio is just sitting there playing the song because you haven't actually gone inside and pushed the buttons. And that
or use the tools to.
So she's talking about how to infiltrate the emotional part of the brain. It really takes these tools like cognitive behavioral therapy. Now they're using like psychedelic drugs with memory recall. I mean, so many therapies are being used now to help reconsolidate our emotional memory to things so that we don't have to take this step of talking ourselves down every time we have this heightened emotional response that is no longer useful to us. Our emotional brain doesn't care. It's like, nope, sorry, this is keeping you safe, and that's my only job, is to keep you safe. And it does not know that that information is no longer needed because flowers are actually not dangerous in every situation. It doesn't know that, our emotional brains. It's very primitive. It's a very primitive part of the brain. So I found that so fascinating.
No. I think it's fascinating that, and I think it speaks to the dynamic that Elise has with her partner, Rowan.
Yes,
because he was a soldier in Iraq and he did things, and so he has his own set of trauma, whereas Elise is reacting of like muscle memory of training that she has never fired her weapon in, I think, 12 years.
Her
training. Muscle memory kicks in, so she's able to resolve the threat to keep herself safe and the customers in the store, and it's played against Rowan, who was a soldier, for many years, and is trying to reconcile that as well.
Yeah, I mean, her relationship with Rowan, it's sort of like this little triangle. She has her relationship with her husband, which is problematic, but, but physical and intimate and all of that. And then she has this really deep connection with her partner, Rowan, which is not a romantic relationship, but it's very emotional, and they're very connected, and even more so after she goes through this trauma, because he understands what she's going through, and he's trying to explain to her, like, you need to go through, get to the other side, and you will adjust. And he keeps saying to her, you'll learn, you'll build calluses around it. You'll not always feel this raw and this terrible. And her response is, no, I don't want to go there. I don't want to go to this place where I don't feel this anymore. And it's just part of me. I don't want it to be part of me.
Right.
And so that's part of her obsession with finding this tall man, is that she thinks if she can hear from him that she needed to take that shot, that somehow her trauma will be relieved and she won't have to go through the pain of processing the experience, which of course is not true, but that's what she's in denial, which is that first stage of trauma recovery or trauma response, is denial. And she's stuck in denial for pretty much the whole book. And Rowan is there, like, and that is why she is doesn't pull him in deeper into her behavior to stop this man, which, really quite extreme behavior that she goes to. She breaks all the rules and sort of gloves off and becomes really badass, and maybe irrational, but, but because Rowan is, trying to make her stay this course of, being in therapy with, doing these things that are rational and to get her through it. And she wants no part of that.
Exactly. Yeah. And I thought, just it speaks to your character, development, because even though he talks about having calluses around his heart, he's just a really cool guy. He comes over and he visits with her kids and he calls her little girls the little wardens.
The wardens.
It's just, he's a very sweet guy. And it's kind of like, we're not all bad, we're not all good, right? There's some very tender moments. So
absolutely. And even Wade, who's, sort of the bad guy.
Yeah.
There's enough backstory there, hopefully, to support what happens to him, in that. And this is the other cool piece of psychology. And then I'll stop talking about psychology, but he has experienced this trauma as well. And he goes into the store already emotionally compromised, and his reaction, right, his sort of visceral, instinctual reaction is not really great. He is not a hero, quite the opposite.
Right.
And that shatters what's left of his already fragile ego, which is often at the heart of a sociopathic illness and these sorts of breaks into really, sort of psychopathic behavior. So he has this break when his ego is completely shattered by his behavior in the store. And then added on, he has rescue worship, which is, again, this was so interesting to read about. So when you're in a traumatic situation like that, and one person saves your life, someone, just one person with a face and a name, this notion of rescue worship, it goes beyond just being grateful or thankful. It's actually a way of staying in denial about the trauma and what happened. Because if you can believe that this person was meant to save you, that this whole thing happened so that you would meet this person and be connected to this person, it allows you to put that experience into a container of not random. It can't happen again.
Correct.
It was preordained. It was, by God, by the universe, by faith, whatever you believe in. And so by clinging to that belief, by worshiping your rescuer, you can stay in denial about the fact that these things happen in life, and we have to sort of get through and put our emotional response in a place that allows us to go on living when any number of bad things can happen to us every day. And so I thought that was so interesting. Like, wow, I thought rescue worship was just sort of being grateful and, this,
I didn't realize how to the extreme.
It's so layered. Yeah. It's so deep psychologically. So yeah, he has rescue worship as well.
Yeah. Fascinating. I have to say that you have a Spotify playlist for this book.
Oh my gosh. Yes, I do.
I know. And the very first song.
Was it good? Was it dead on? Yay.
Yes. So those of you, should we tell people?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. You can find it. It's on my website, and it's on Spotify under Wendy Walker, I think, What Remains. The first song is Chris Isaak, Wicked Game. And so I just have to tell the story. So my publisher was like, do you want to do a Spotify playlist? And I thought, this is a serious topic that the book is tackling, and serious, psychological issues. It starts with a shooting. Like, these are not like, some thrillers are kind of fun and sexy, and you can have like sexy songs, and it's fun to do a playlist. And I wasn't sure I'd be able to pull it off. But then I broke it down into the themes of the book. So the first one was Obsession.
Mm-hmm.
And I started, and actually my son was visiting, and he introduced me to AI. So we went on Chat GPT and said, what songs deal with obsession?
Mm-hmm.
And there was, Every Breath You Take by The Police, which is not a love song. It's a song about a stalker.
Correct.
And Wicked Game. And when I played it, of course I'd heard it before, but when I played it, I thought, wow, this mood.
Yeah.
And that motivated me to finish the playlist. Yeah.
Yeah. So well done. Make sure everybody goes
Thanks.
to, check out the playlist. Can you talk a little bit about what you're working on right now?
Yeah. So, first American Girl, which was an Audible original, actually did really well. It was a #1 Audible across all of their fiction for 2 weeks, and it was on their top 10 list for 7 weeks. So it did really well for them, and so that inspired me to bring it to print. So it's being published in October by Blackstone Publishing, and October 17th. And I'm really excited because I love this story so much. It's about an autistic 17-year-old girl who witnesses something. I don't want to say exactly what it is, but something. And then there's a wealthy store owner in this very small town in Pennsylvania is found murdered. And so she is swept into the investigation because she's caught on a security camera. So the police know that she was there.
Right.
And she spends the entire book keeping herself safe because now everyone knows that she saw something.
Right.
And the murderer is among them, and keeping the people that she loves safe as well from the police and from the killer. So it's a whodunit, but it's also very psychological as well, because the way she sees the world is really fascinating, being neurodivergent, and every character in that book was designed to sort of be a personification of what women go through in different stages of life and the things that women experience. Her mother, the women that she's friends with at the sandwich shop where she works, and her best friend. So it has young love. It has, the bedraggled mothers of 4, working minimum wage, all these things. And then I have another Audible original that's coming out in 2024 called Mad Love, and that is going to be a fully scripted audio play. So it will sound like a radio play with sound effects and a full cast of characters. And I'm sort of describing it as Dirty John meets the Tinder swindler meets me.
Oh, can't wait.
It's going to be fun. It's going to be really fun. I'm like, when is it going to be produced? Because I came up with a really cool twist at sort of in the last revision. And I was so happy about it. And so I wrote it into the whole script, and I'm really, really excited.
And that's what American Girl reminded me of is, before I was a librarian, I was in radio. And so like having things produced and the difference between being read versus read aloud, and how you captured that and the dialogue and the sound effects and the crunch of the gravel and the doors closing. I absolutely loved it.
Thank you.
So I can't wait for Mad Love 2024.
Oh, good. Yes. Yeah. I'm really excited about that. And then of course I'm working on another novel to go to print. So lots of things.
Lots of
happening.
things. Yes. Is there anything that you want people to know that I have not asked you yet?
Wow. I think we've covered everything. I guess I would just say that this book is not about shootings at all. It's not a political commentary. I think everyone on all spectrums, agrees that there are too many shootings, and they're pretty much daily now. And so this is not about a mass shooting, and the book does not deep dive into what happens in the department store, even though it did on the first draft. At all. It's the first chapter, and then it's Elisa's story of trauma. And I actually tried to rewrite it to make it just like a hold up in a convenience store, and it just didn't have it didn't land, is how I think of it. It didn't have the impact, because I think shootings are something we all are exposed to in the news so much that it's sort of like reading about a fire or a massive car crash. There are things that we are really afraid of that are so prevalent and happen so frequently that they're already in our minds. So when if we were to hear a pop that we recognize as gunfire, we are immediately going to go to that fear response of, it's a mass shooter, I am in danger. And that was really necessary to create that trauma for these characters. And so that's the reason that it's in there. And so it's not a political commentary at all. It's really about this one cop and her emotional response to something she experiences in the line of duty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well done. So this is a series, Writers Unplugged, that supports Cleveland Reads, which is literacy based. Can you tell us why literacy is important to you?
Oh my gosh. I mean, wow. It's so much, first of all, just for, surviving in a professional capacity and just in life, being able to express ourselves in words, I think is so incredible. And so many things that we can write that we can't say, or that, we're able to express in written form, that would surprise us when we don't know how to express it verbally. And then also being able to read other people's stories, fiction, nonfiction. So, I mean, obviously education, right? Just being able to learn facts and learn from textbooks and from reading, but also just to be able to read the stories of other people, both fiction and nonfiction, really that's what makes us, human. It's what gives us empathy for others. It's what makes us feel we're not alone and makes us feel connected. So, it's a basic human need and a human right that should be protected and nurtured.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm joined by national and international, so fun to say that, best-selling writer Wendy Walker. It has to even be better knowing that you've done that. So we'll go to the final 5 questions, right? What do you miss most about practicing law?
Honestly,
clearly not the hours.
Yeah, no, I do miss the pure intellectualism of it. So, and I also miss the clients. I know a lot of divorce lawyers, family law attorneys, find that to be a very difficult aspect. But I do miss them. I miss being able to relate to them and help them navigate probably one of the most difficult things I'll ever go through. And also just drafting documents, even as a corporate attorney, just really seeing something as a puzzle and knowing that there's a right answer. With fiction, there's no right answer. So sometimes that is really daunting to look at a blank page and think, okay, whatever I put down is the answer. But with the law, sometimes there just really is a right way to draft something. And it uses kind of a different part of the brain, which I kind of miss.
Okay. Do you prefer to read books or listen to books?
I prefer to read if I have a choice and the time, but I do enjoy, if I'm driving, I love to listen to books when I'm driving. But if I'm just sitting at home and I can do either, I usually choose to read.
That's how I am, because I've learned that trying to read while driving is dangerous.
Yeah.
Until we have like those AI cars, right, where I can just kind of kick back.
That's and trying to listen at home sometimes, I'll be listening and trying to do something, and I'll get distracted. And I'm like, trying to do something with a screwdriver. I'm like, wait, I need to focus.
Oh, so, I've driven right past my own house because I'm like engaged in the story. I'm like,
definitely, definitely.
What writers do you fangirl over?
Oh my gosh, you know what? I'm gonna take the easy way out and say there's really no writer that I fangirl over, but there are definitely books.
Oh, I thought you were say librarians, but okay.
Yeah, that I have writer and okay. So, the Quiet Tenant, which just came out, is so dark and unique and amazing. And there are some classics like The Kite Runner, which I still, emulate and just love the way that story unfolded. There's a book called Girl A by Abigail Dean, which I just found. I read every single word. Notes on an Execution was amazing. Same thing. I read every word. My Dark Vanessa.
Yes.
Read every word of that book. I don't always read every word of every book. So that's why I'm saying that, because sometimes, I kind of know where the plot's going and not everything is sort of touching me. I'm calibrated to be able to tolerate a lot of drama and a lot of stuff. And I kind of can see where a passage of dialogue is going. So I will find that I start skimming till I get to a bit where I don't know where it's going, or it makes me feel something. So a book that makes me read every word because it's evoking something in me and making me feel something is really, that's what I remember and what I, really treasure.
What book do you think everybody should read?
Wow. Oh, I don't think there is a book everyone should read. I mean,
every book I think teaches you something.
Yeah, every book teaches you something. Yeah, for sure. Honestly, I think, there are some nonfiction, works that people should read just to be knowledgeable about
human being. Yeah.
Yes. And honestly, these books about our brain, any book about trauma processing, there are so many out there now. Oh my gosh, doing that research has given me insight into my own brain and my own little traumas. And I use that knowledge all the time for myself. And I'm sure my friends are annoyed with me because I'm always giving them advice based on it. But yeah, I think understanding how our minds work is so important for our own happiness, mental health, and also the way we treat others and the way we view the world and react to the world. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's like emotional intelligence.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, exactly.
So, and then the final question, with any of your books, would you ever write a crossover with the characters?
Yeah, I did write a little sequel to All Is Not Forgotten. It's another Audible called Hold Your Breath, and it has a really cool twist, and I loved that. But, I not necessarily as a novel, but I definitely see what remains as an ongoing series. I love Elise and Rowan. And so I'm like pushing. I mean, it's with my film and TV agents, and they've just started going out with it. But it's the first book of mine that I actually see an ongoing series. I see the path for it. I see, and I feel as though there's such so many stories that could be told from the work that Elise and Rowan do, but also from the emotions that are evoked from that work. And then, of course, all the personal stories that are unfolding in the book that could be carried forward. So I'm hoping, I really see a path for it. But of course, that's not up to me. So
who do I need to talk to, or who do we as readers need to talk to, right? Because it would make a wonderful series, especially balancing cold case with new technology. I think
oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And my source is so fascinating. She had so many stories. I couldn't put them all in. And she came to meet me the other day at a book event. It was the first time I'd met her in person. And I gave her this huge hug. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so grateful to you. But then even in this like short amount of time, we had a conversation about another case that caused this intense emotional reaction in her. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I need to find a way to use that. I need this series to be written so that I can put all that in. Yeah, it's fascinating, her stories and the journey that she goes through. And I don't think there are a lot of cop shows out there with a female lead where she's not completely badass, but she's kind of, can I say badass? Sorry, but she's not, she's a little badass, but also really emotionally vulnerable and pushed and pulled by her emotional responses and willing to admit it and not just bury it and be sort of tough, but, have to process it. And I don't know, I think that would really make an interesting show. So we'll see.
Without a doubt, it would. So I want to say thank you to Wendy Walker of latest book, What Remains, for joining us this evening, for your generosity of time. Thank you to our tech team for making sure everything looks and sounds good. Copies of Wendy's books are available. Maxbacks Books, that's our fabulous independent bookstore. And then thanks to all of you who are watching and to listening to Writers Unplugged, sharing your love of reading with each other. I'm Jen Jumbo with Cleveland Public Library. Happy reading.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And love libraries and everything you do.
Yeah, thank you.
So wonderful.